they were using it as a bookmark or something.
What are you gonna do it? Great. This is somewhere to do. We're doing it for LA County Council. Mostly here on the PDC family. Hi, Larry. You have another one just left behind you?
No, I don't. She didn't come.
I have faith. I have faith. Hi, those on Zoom. Shabbat Shalom. Who's there? Shabbat Shalom to Jason and to David Kaplan. There are things that are blocking the screen, so I can't see everyone who I know is there. But hello to all of you. Just the wrong slipper.
The hair tummy isn't exactly looking at the theme.
I saw that. Speaking of Rhoda, I think that Lulav
Oh, I see it. I see a lulav there.
2019 is
I see
there.
that lulav.
It'll be good for kindling for next Pesach.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Nice and dry.
Avi, are you laning?
Not that I know of.
Is anyone here laning? Oh, wonderful. When we get a minion Avi, you want to dive in?
I could be happy to do that.
How was it by mitzvah?
It was really lovely.
Really nice.
It's a very special family, which all families are very special, yes.
Great.
But there was a lot of emotion on the Bima, and both parents read Torah, and both sisters either read Torah or did something else in the Bima. It was just a lovely feeling.
It was Tate, right? Tate's son.
Yeah, Aaron.
Was that the only
Lama?
llama that wasn't there?
There were other llamas there. Stuart was there. Larry Brandon was there.
Did Aaron read Torah?
Yeah. The beautiful new stuff. Nice tunes. And we had a prayer for peace done in Hebrew to Lois Agoy, which was really nice.
That's Shtiebel.
Oh, that's a thing?
That's how we do it at Shtiebel.
I like it.
Yeah. Sort of also sort of a high point of the service because, Shachri people aren't necessarily there and they drifted during the Torah service. So that's actually the sort of the first singing thing when the minion is actually at full strength.
Got it. I like that. All right. I'm going to keep my Yanu. All right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone who's joining on Zoom. We're going to start Mincha in the Lev Shalem. Yeah, please. Lev Shalem, page 200 and 214. I don't have the page numbers of the Siddur in front of you, but look for Shabbat Mincha and you'll find it.
Slim Shalom was 226 and Deep Shalom was 558. Thank you, Joe.
Ashrei Yoshevei Beitecha Ujalu Chasel Hashem Shekachu Hashem Shalom Rav Gilad Avi Aravim Chai Lagner B'Chol Yom Avarchek Tov Adonai L'Kol Rachamav Al Kol Masal Yisrael. Tilat Adonai daber pi, vivarech kol basar shem kodsho le'olam ba'ed, v'anachnu nevarech yah, me'at haver olam, hallelujah, uval etzion goel, javei v'eshnu. V'at hakadosh yoshev tilo Yisrael, v'kara ze el ze, v'amar kadosh, 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 Adonai tzivahot. Atisaini rach v'eshmacharai, kol ra'ash gadol baruch Adonai mimekomo. Adonai imloch le'olam ba'ed. V'yivtechu v'chayo da'ei shemech, ha'kilo asafta dor shecha Adonai, Adonai chavetz l'man tzidko, yagdil Torah, v'yadir, yigadal v'yigadash, shemei rabbah, be'elamad yivrach yurtei, v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon, v'yomechon, v'chayidechol beit Yisrael, v'agalav zman kariv, v'imru, amen, yehei shemei rabbah mevarach, v'elamal ma'imaya yivrach v'shabach, v'pravrit no'am v'nasei, v'dadavi v'lal, shemei degutsha, b'richu le'elam mikol b'rata, v'shirata, v'tushbata v'nechamata, Damiran Balama Vimru Amen. Vani Tfilati Lecha Adonai Ratzon Elohim Berov Chastecha Aneni Biamet Yishecha Vayibin Zaron Vayomer Moshe Kum Adonai Vefutoi Vecha Vienusu Mizanecha Mibanecha Kimitzion Deitzei Torah Dvar Adonai Min Yerushalayim Baruch Shanatan Torah Lamo Yisrael V'Kedushato.
Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu. Joe, you want to be a guy by Shiny? Okay, we read Parshat Shlach Lecha, which we'll study a little bit more of in a little bit in the Eitz Chaim Chumash.
Okay. Shlach Lecha can be found in your Eitz Chaim Chumash on page 840. If you're in another Chumash or a Tanakh, it's chapter 13 of the book of Numbers.
Anybody have a yort site this week needs a Aliyah? Avi. Anyone else? ותגלה ותראה מלכותו, אלוהים בזמן קרוב, יחום פליטתנו ופליטת עמו בית ולכן לחסרח מן הצום ונאמר אמן. הכל הבו גולו הננו חבו לתורה, יעמוד. יוסף. Yosef Ben, is it Yosef? Yosef Eitan Ben. Yaakov Halevi. Yonin Eli Arishana Baruch Shanatan Torah Lamos B'Kedushato. Vatem B'Bekim Lachem. Hayim Kolchem Hayom.
Baruch Adonai Baruch.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Baed.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Olam Ba'ed. Baruch Adonai Baruch Olam Asher
Amen. וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, שלח לך אנשים, ויתורו את ארץ כנען, אשר אני נותן לבני ישראל, איש אחד, למטה אבותיו תשלחו כל נשיא בהם, וישלח אותם משה ממדבר פרן, על פי אדוני כולם אנשים ראשי בני ישראל המה.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיילנו בתוכנו, ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen. Tamod, Rivka, Machava, Yaakov, Yashtika.
Page 840, verse 4. That's because we're the last line.
ברכו את אדוני המבורך.
ברוך אדוני מבורך לעולם ועד.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
אמן. ואלה שמותם למטה ראובן שמוע בן זכור, למטה שמעון שפט בן חורי, למטה יהודה כלב בן יפונה, למטה יששכר גדעל בן יוסף, למטה אפרים הושע בן נון, למטה בנימין פלטי בן רפו, למטה זבולון גדיאל בן סודי, למטה יוסף למטה מנשה גדי בן סוסי, למטה דן עמיאל בן גמלי, למטה אשר סטור בן מיכאל, למטה נפתלי נחבי בן ופסי, למטה גד גאואל בן מחי. אלה שמות האנשים אשר שלח משה לתור את הארץ, ויקרא משה להושיע בן נון יהושע.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
אמן.
Tamod, הבחור היום הולדת. Yamod, Yosef ben Michael, Yashishit.
Page 841, verse 17.
Baruch hu Adonai habarach.
Baruch Adonai מבורך לעולם ועד.
Baruch Adonai baruch לעולם ועד. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
אמן. וישלח אותם משה לתור את ארץ כנען, ויאמר עליהם, עלו זה בנגב ועליתם את ההר, וריתם את הארץ מהי, ואת העם היושב עליה, החזק הוא הרפה, המעט הוא עם רעב, ומה הארץ אשר הוא יושב בה, הטובה הוא עם רעה, ומה הערים אשר הוא יושב בהנה, הבמחנים עם בבצרים, ומה הארץ השמנה היא עם רזה, היש בה עץ עם עין, והתחזקתם ולקחתם מפרי הארץ, והימים ימי ביקורי ענבים.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורה אמת וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
יישר כוח.
Let's get a chair out here. Vezot HaTorah asher sam Moshe b'nei Israel al yad Adonai We'll pause and we'll sing some El Malei Rachamim, memorial prayers. Avi, do you want to start with yours? Okay. Bechavod. Who's this for?
My mother.
And her name?
Sivya, bat Golda v'Chaim Eliezer. I'll repeat it for you if you
El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamtzei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Ashchina, B'malot Kadoshim U'Tohorim, Kezohar Haraki Amazirim, Benishmat Sivya Bat Golda v'Chaim Eliezer, Shalcha Liolama. Began Eden Tehei Menuchata, Anaha Balarachamim, Hastireya Beseter Knafecha Liolamim, Utzror Betzrachim et Nishmata, Adonai Hu Nachalata, Betanuach Beshalom Al Mishkava, Benomar Amen. How do you want to share memory of your mother?
Sure. My mother, Zal, has been gone now this week. It's going to be 30 years. It's a long time. I missed out on having her be a grandmother to our children. Her life was very full, and my life is very full, but no one gets to have everything. But that's something I'm sad that we didn't have. She raised me and my brother with a very good foundation for life, which of course I did not always appreciate at the time. I appreciate that now. And so when I get to see her, that's what I'm going to tell her.
Anyone else have your site this week? Anyone on Zoom have your site? Okay, we'll continue with returning the Sefer Torah to the Ark on page 221 in the Lev Shalem.
Yeah, hallelujah, Shem Adonai, ki niskav shemo levado, hodol eretz hashamayim, vayarn karen lam, oti lav oziyat, v'shelach ro, hallelujah, David mizmor. Zedor dor shamayim. Mi hu ze melech hakavod, Adonai tzvaot, melech hakavod, zelav l'kol yoman. Hashivenu Adonai lecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kikedem. Yitkadali kadash shemei rabba ve'alamadi rachirutev yamlich mahudei b'chayron u'vyomechon u'chayidachol be'Yisrael v'galav zman kariv v'imru amen yehei shemei rabba mevarach le'lam almei almaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitparit ram v'yitnasei v'yitadavid alevid al shebed gusha b'riku le'la migol b'rata v'shirata tushvata v'negamata damiran be'alema v'imru amen.
petition the Amidah begins 223, remain standing through the Kedusha 225.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Eloi Avotenu v'Imotenu Eloi Abraham Elohei Yitzchak v'Eloi Yaakov Elohei Sarah Eloi Rivka Eloi Rachel v'Eloi Leah Hayel HaGadol HaGibor v'Anorai L'Elyon Gomel Chasadim Tovim v'Konei HaKol Zocher Chesdei Avot v'Imahot U'Mivigoel Livnei V'Nehem L'man Shemo B'Yavah Melech Ozer Ufokenu Moshiach U'Magen Baruch atah Adonai Magen Avraham Ufokei Tzara Atah Gibor L'Lam Adonai Mechayim Itim Atah Rav Lo Shia Mechalkel Chaim B'Chesed Mechayim Itim Rachamim Rabim Somech Novelim Verfech Holim Tir Asurim Chayim Amto Shnei Afar Michamoch Abalvorot Umidom Melach Melech Memit Chayim Atzmech Shoav Nemanata Lachayot Meitim Baruch Atah Adonai Mechayei Hametim Nekadesh et Shimcha Ba'olam Kshem Shma Kishim Oto V'Shmei Marom Kagado Yanu Yachal Krazeh El Zeh Ve'Amar Kadosh 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 Adonai Tzvaot Meloch Haaretz Kvodo Umatam Baruch Yomeru Baruch Kevod Adonai Mi Mekomo Jericho Chachakatuv Limor Hallelujah Lador Ador Nagigolach Al Netzan Zechim Kshatcha Nagdish Shivara Eloheinu Mipinu Le'emush Le'lam Va'ed Ki El Melech Gadol V'Kadosh Ata Baruch Ata Adonai Ha'el HaKadosh Ata Echad V'Shimcha Echad Umiki Ha'amach Yisrael Goy Echad Ba'aretz Tiferet Gedula V'Ateret Yeshua Yom Menucha Kedusha Le'Mecha Natata Avraham Yagel Yitzchak Yiranein Yaakov V'Anav Yanuch Vo Menuchat Ava Unava Menuchat Emet V'Una Menuchat Shalom Shava V'Ashkeit V'Vetach Menucha Shalima Shetar Rotze Ba Yaku V'Neicha V'Yedu Ki Meitecha Menuchatam Ve'al Menuchatam Yaktishu Et Shemecha Eloheinu V'Leavotenu V'Imotenu Ritzei Menuchatenu Kadeshenu Mizotecha V'Tenu Elkeinu V'Toratecha Sabeinu Mituvecha V'Samcheinu V'Yeshuatecha V'Ter Libeinu Lovtecha Be'emet V'Anchilenu Adonaiheinu V'Yavav Ratzon Shabbat Kodechecha V'Enuchu V'Yisrael Mekadshei Shemecha Baruch Atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat Ritzei Adonai Eloheinu V'Amcha Yisrael Utfilatam V'Shevet HaVaval Yitvi Reitecha Utfilatam B'Avat Te'apel B'Ratzon Hilo Ratzon Tamid Avodat Yisrael Amecha V'Derech Einainu B'Shuchal Zion V'Rachamim Baruch Atah Adonai Hamachazir Shchinato L'Tzion Modim Anachnu La Shata Adonai Eloheinu L'Idem V'Ed Tzur Chayin Magin Shini Matahu L'Dor V'Ador Nodel Chan Saper T'Del Chayinu Hamzur V'Adecha V'Alish V'Dinu Abudol Lach Al Nisecha Shol Yom Imanu V'Al Nisecha Hatov kilo chalu rachamech, avar machem kilo tamucha sadecha, me'olam kivinu lach, ve'al kol hamitrach, v'tramam shimcha malkeinu tamid l'olam va'ed, v'chol ha'chayim yotu chasel, avilot shimcha be'med, el yishuatenu v'ezratenu sela, baruch ata Adonai, hatov shimcha l'chaneh lehodot, Shalom Rav Al Yisrael Amachav Al Kol Yoshvei Tevel Tasim Leolam Ki Ata Melech Adon Chol HaShalom V'Tov Beinech Al Varech Amcha Yisrael V'Chol Eid V'Chol Shah B'Shlomecha Baruch Ata Adonai Amvarech Edom Yisrael B'Shalom Tzidkacha Tzedek Leolam V'Toratcha Emet Tzidkatcha Elohim Ad Marom Asher Asita Gdolot Elohim Michamocha Tzidkatcha Kariel Mishpatecha Tom Rabbah Adam Uveima Toshia Adonai Yirav Yirash Shemei Rabbah Ve'elamad Yirach Yerdei Ve'emlich Machudei V'chayechon V'yomechon V'chayit Chol Israel V'glav Zman Kariv Imru Amen Yehei Shemei Rabbah Mevarach Ve'elam Almei Almayah Yitvarach V'shabaf Yitrav V'nam Yinasei V'yirav Yitalev Yitalash V'yirusha Brechu Leila Mekobrata V'shirata Tishvata V'nechmata Tamiran Be'alma V'imru Amen Titkavel Tzadanav Chol Israel Kodam Avahun Shmaya V'imru Amen Yehei Shalom Rabbah Mitzmaya V'chayim Aleinu V'chol Yisrael V'imru Amen Oseh Shalom B'Ramav V'yaseh Shalom Aleinu Al Kol Yisrael Al Kol Yoshvei Tevel V'imru Amen Aleinu L'Shabeach Adonai V'nemar v'yadonai melech al kol haaretz bayom ahu yadonai echad u'shmo echad Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah ve'alama divrach yirutei ve'amlich malchutei בחייכון ויומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם עמל מיה יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמך דקודשה בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. ועושה שלום במרומיו ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו אמן.
Amen. Shakoach to Avi for Mincha and to Scott for laning. Zoomers, stick with us. We're just going to give about 5 or 10 minutes to get food, and then we'll start the Torah study. The text sheet was sent out in the Shabbat email. Hopefully you have access to it, but don't go away.
Yeah. Rabbi?
Yeah.
Our Talmud is not looking very nearish.
It's just a nair. Great.
Well, we got the eternal part.
No. Oh, yeah, you're right. What was it? Joe, did you get the table?
Although I haven't said certain paragraphs of your language. Oh, you know what? I changed. I do the
I don't know about the rest of people, these bagels are kind of hard. Maybe it's just mine then. Yeah.
I'm going to deal with it, right? Like I'm not sharing those quotes just positively.
You do want to put it in. You don't want to put that other quote in print. On a Safari assortment that could be read by.
You'll actually like this, Shior.
Yeah, I would.
You, look at the Choza.
Yeah.
Tiru.
An extra.
Fran, would you bring me a fork, please? No?
All right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom, those who are here in person in Pilchal. Shabbat Shalom to the Zoomers. Again, just because of the way it's on the screen, I know that there are people who are here whom I don't see. I think the back racks are here. I see Tybal, I see David Kaplan, I see Rosenbaum, I see Joe, but there might be others, and if I haven't welcomed you by name, I'm sorry. And maybe Nina is there with Jason. I have different methodologies for how I come to a Shabbat morning sermon. Sometimes there's something I want to say, and I find a way to connect it to the Parsha. Sometimes I want to say something sweeping about the Parsha, try to like really get to what this Parsha is all about. And then sometimes I go touring, and I start looking at the Parsha until a word or a phrase or idea catches my mind, and I go down a rabbit hole and I see if there's something there, and if there's something isn't there, I go back up and I go to the next one, and then there will be a teaching that will organically emerge from a particular curiosity I find in the verse. And I don't even have a methodology for which of those methodologies I use any particular Shabbat. Sometimes it's just based on what's going on. My methodology for teaching on Shabbat afternoon, for a reason that I can't explain to you, is always the same. It's always in that last category. I never on a Shabbat afternoon have interest in like encapsulating a parsha. I want to do Torah study. And what's Torah study? It's looking at the verses until something catches your eye and explore it with depth. When you go that route into Torah study, sometimes it is easy to forget to pull out and actually ask the larger question as to what's actually going on in the larger sweep of the story. In this situation, by using the methodology that I normally do, which is to pinpoint one small thing and go exploring, it actually brought me unexpectedly back to larger issues in the Parsha, which is a way of introducing this and saying that where I ended up when I was preparing for this is not at all where I thought I was going to end up. If you think about what Parshat Shlach Lecha is all about, it's really the Jewish people's post-Exodus first encounter with the notion of the land of Israel as a destination worth going to. Right, so we know Eretz Canaan from Breshit, but we're not a people yet. We're a family, right? There's no pre-Zionism, I don't think, really in Sefer Breshit. I mean, you can pull it out of Kum v'hita lech ba'aretz, the argument given to Abraham, but it's given to a man and a family. By the time we're in Parshat Sefer B'Midbar, and you have a nation in the description of the Torah headed towards a land that is promised to them, you begin to see the biblical seeds of the idea that we're supposed to develop a civilization there. And by looking closely at one word, we're going to hopefully get to some of the most important and the thorniest and the most uncomfortable aspects of what it means to bring Jewish sovereignty to the land of Israel then and now. Okay, so that's my intro. So we start with the second verse of the parsha, the first verse of any significance, and it's the first source on the sheet. Natan, do you want to read Shlach Lecha Nashim? Okay, so the command given to Moshe, shlach is a root that's pretty simple, to send. The lacha, there are many, many commentaries on what the lacha is doing there. Send for yourself, send only when it's good for you. Maybe it's just a grammatical oddity. Anashim is supposed to send men. V'yaturu, they shall tour. I think it is just etymological coincidence, not etymological connection, that the Hebrew word latur is a homophone, to the English word tour. I don't think English tourism is connected to Latour, but they actually mean the same thing, or they're close to it. A tayyar in Hebrew is a tourist, someone who does touring, Latour, but it's just a coincidence. And we're going to drill down what that root might mean. Whatever these anashim are supposed to be doing, they're supposed to be tarring or touring from the root taf vav resh, the land of Canaan. Which land of Canaan? Asher anino tein lebnei Israel, that I am giving to the land to the children of Israel. Understanding it's a present tense verb. And then some other descriptions: ish echad, one person, lematev atav, from the family, the tribe of his father. Tishlachu, you should send one per person. Kol nasi bahem, each one should be a prince. Okay. If we didn't know that vayaturu looked like and sounded like the English word tour, and you knew every other word in the sentence, but you didn't know that one, what would you guess the force of the verb vayaturu is? Send the men to do what to the land of Israel? Spy. Okay, so now go deeper in spy. What does spy mean in that English sentence, Joel?
To see what it's like so that we can come in and know what we're up against and what.
Okay, so classic spying, right? Going to see how challenging it might be for us to go there and make it our home, right? Which is actually very different than the modern Hebrew tayyar, because the modern Hebrew tayyar, tourist, that does come from this verb, is not going somewhere to see if they can make it their home. It's the opposite, right? It's going to a place that's not their home so they can just visiting, right? But this vayaturu, perhaps, according to Joel, is implying a going there so that eventually you will not be just visiting, you will be inhabiting. Again, forget everything else you know about the story and just the verse. What else could vayaturu mean if you didn't know what it meant? Divide. Say more about that. Yeah?
Divide the country to the different families or tribes.
All right, so if we literally didn't know what the root meant, maybe they're being sent to pre-divide, because we know that there are tribes that are going to be sent there, and they're going to each have specific sections. Good. What else? Any other possibilities? Scott? Right. If we really didn't know what vayaturu meant, then perhaps they're on a mission not only to check it out, but to do a pre-conquering. If we knew the vayaturu was something about looking or espying or investigating, are there any other shades of that meaning that could be implied here? Reconnaissance, surveillance, the topography, right? And we're going to get those details later. The laning that Scott did, it tells us, right? So this word actually there's a perush on this word in the verses that follow in the parsha. But from just the word, it could mean to check out what enemies might be there, to check out the terrain so that we can plan our attack properly, and it could be just to see what it looks like. Okay. Ibn Ezra, who is a grammarian in addition to a commentator, This is what he says. This is the second source. Vayaturu, vayichapsu. So he says, he turns Vayaturu. He says, reader, if you don't know that root Vayaturu, if you haven't seen the tour buses in Israel with that root all over it, it means Vayichapsu. Lechapes means to search. He softens a little bit, right? He says, the only thing Vayatur means is just to seek out, right? It doesn't necessarily mean to seek out in order to conquer. It just means to look closely. But then he gives an interesting proof text or a similarity text. V'chein, this is the same as velo taturu. When I sing it like that, you know where that comes from the third paragraph of the Shema. He says that verb, velo taturu, which we'll look at in a second, is the same as vayaturu. And Ibn Ezra says the taturu there in that section also means to seek out, to look for something which might not be obvious. Let's look at that verse. That is a few chapters later in the Parsha. So it's the same Parsha, but a different section altogether. This is Tzitzit, chapter 15 of Bamidbar, verse 39. V'hayalachem l'tzitzit, these fringes, these should be to you as a fringe. Ureitem oto, you shall look at them. Some people, when they're davening, they take their tzitzit and they put it in front of their eyes in that moment. You're supposed to actually see them. Why are you supposed to look at them? As a reminder. Uzchartem et kol mitzvot Adonai, so you should remember all the mitzvot of God. Vasitem otam, and you shall do them. Velo taturu, you shall not what? Acharei levavchem v'acharei nechem, you shall not what after your heart and your eyes? Follow. But how can we not follow our eyes? What are we not supposed to be doing after our hearts and our eyes in this section? What does the verb mean? Right? We think that the notion is not to desire, right? And acharei, after your hearts and your eyes, asher atem zonim achareihem, which you would be inclined to zonim. Liznot means to do something licentious, something that is not permitted in the interpersonal realm. But the verb literally means don't go seeking for it, right? Or at least as Ibn Ezra is using it. If you stay, I mean, we sometimes laugh at or scorn members of the ultra-Orthodox community who will avert their eyes when they're walking down the street and they're seeing someone of the opposite gender, right? Because we live in a society where that's not considered pornographic, that's not considered licentious, that's considered living. But they might be doing exactly what Ibn Ezra says to them doing, is don't go searching after the things, because if you search after them, you might see them, and once you see them, you're going to be inclined to follow them, right? So, lechapes, as he says it means in the verse in Shlach Lecha, is to go searching for something that if you didn't go searching for it, you wouldn't happen on it by itself. You put that back into the original verse, then Ibn Ezra saying, they should do that. They should look for the places in the land of Canaan that they're not going to see if, they were just tourists, right? It's interesting. Tourists generally only see the things that are made available to them, right? You ever have an experience with a really good tour guide and then you transcend touring, right? Because you see things that are not visible to the naked eye if you were just doing it on your own. This is one of the possibilities for what Vayaturu might mean. Let me pause here. Questions or comments on what we've done so far? Because it's going to take some turns. Yes, Warren. And for Zoomers, I'll repeat the question. Yeah. Do you mean in the first verse? Yeah, as opposed to a command. Yeah, the form that it is in Hebrew, it's a vav hayipuch verb, which means the verb looks like it's future, but it's sort of understood as a command, but it could be understood as a prophecy. Yeah, good. Anything else so far? Okay, go to the next source. We go from Middle Ages to late 19th, early 20th century, Hamek Davar. Hamek Davar was written by Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, known as the Netziv. He was the Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin in Lithuania, late 19th century. One of the great one of the great and really digestible commentaries from that generation on Torah. And he also says something on Vayatur Eretz Canaan. I'll read just so that we don't have to repeat again for the people who are on Zoom. Uva Sefer Dvarim, and in the book of Dvarim, where, chapter 1, verse 24, Ketiv is written, Vayavo ad Nachal Eshkol, they should go all the way to the Wadi of Eshkol, Vayiraglu at Ota. He's going to be comparing the root latur, from which we get the verb vayaturu, to liragel, which is used in that verse. Liragel is related, of course, to the word regel, which means foot, right? Like a aliyat regel is a pilgrimage. But what does it mean to feet a place, to foot a place? We could play around with it. It means to go there by foot, so you're seeing every nook and cranny. But what does the Torah mean when it says that they were supposed to vayiraglu ota, particularly since the spies, scouts in our parsha, Shlach Lacha, are sometimes referred to in Hebrew as the miraglim, right? The ones who got there by foot. And in modern Hebrew, that is actually a proper word for a spy. So what's the difference? B'chein kativ lahalan, and also it says later on in that same chapter, in the same book, chapter 21, verse 32 of Dvarim, Liragel at Ya'azer. They were supposed to go scout out, I translated it here as a spy, a place called Ya'azer. Ve'hahevdel ben latur, o liragelhu. There is a distinction between the verb latur, which we were playing with in our parsha, and liragel, both having to do with going to a place and checking it out. Tehaholech lirot, eza makom tov yoter lichbosh, lichbosh misham, shayach lashon vayaturu. If you're going to see which is the place itself within the whole area they're going to, that might be the proper one to try to conquer, that's vayaturu. Vayaturu is, I haven't decided even where I'm going to conquer. I know that this whole area is possible, but I'm going to figure out from my vayaturing what's the vulnerable spot, what's the weak spot, how can I get in there? Demashma'o, for its meaning is, like Ibn Ezra, mechapes, seek out, meaning you don't know yet. Mechapes ezemakom hu atov yoter li'inyano. Which of these potential places to conquer is the best place to achieve that successfully? The ayin, look, he says, mashagatafti beparshat tzitzit. He says, I already wrote something similar about this on the same section we looked at before, parshat tzitzit, bepasuk v'lo taturu. On the verse v'lo taturu, I didn't bring you what he said there. Mash ein kain, that's not the case. Haholech lamakom yadua. When you go to a place that you already know, you've already determined that this is the place you can go to. You're not making any decisions about whether or not to conquer this place. Rak lahavin ech lichbosh, lo sheach lashon tur. But you're just trying to figure out how to conquer it. What's the best strategy for taking this place that you've already decided is worth taking? That does not connect to the language of tur. Ella vayiragel, this verb built from the word foot. Sheholech beraglav, that you go with your feet. Lirot tchunat zeh hamakom, to figure out the exact nature of the place. You can actually read this commentary in two different ways. In one way of reading it, liragel is a closer look. You've decided you're going to conquer this place. Now you need to know what's the angle of this mountain over there, and how many days is it going to take and how many soldiers is it going to take, and you can only do that by a close look by foot. Whereas vayatur is I could conquer that area, that area, that area. That one looks better to me from a distance. You could also flip it, right? You could say that in order to know where you're going to make yourself and your armies vulnerable, you need to look at something very, very close up. But once you decided that that is what you're going to conquer, you might be able to figure out how to do it slightly more from a distance. If you pull that reading back into our verse, then what it means is shlach lacha anashim bayaturu eretz Canaan, send the men, because they need to figure out on this trip where we're going to enter and which parts of the land of Canaan, right? We think of the land of Canaan as having a map with particular borders, and we get those borders later on in Parshat Dvarim. But now think of the land of Canaan as a borderless region. It's an area, And there's going to be an area within the area that you're going to conquer or try to conquer, call your own. You've got to figure out what that is on this trip, right? It's a very different understanding of Vayaturu. You're not necessarily figuring out, which enemies you're going to meet, but what part of this whole land is worthy of your attention and worthy of your army's attention. Comments or questions on that? Hamek Davar. Okay, so we've got two readings of Vayaturu that are similar to one another with some subtle differences. And now for something completely different. And this is where my own inquiry this week went not off the rails, but took me places I wasn't expecting to go. The Chose of Lublin, the seer of Lublin, he was the great sage of Lublin and the yeshiva that was there, 18th, 19th century. This is what the Chose of Lublin says on Vayaturu. And he's doing something here which is radical grammatically and radical conceptually. It's so radical grammatically that if I try to do it, people say, that's not what the word means. That if I try to do, they'd say, oh, Rabbi Kligville doesn't know Hebrew so well. But when you're the Chose of Lublin, and everyone knows that you do know Hebrew so well, you can say, like they did in the Talmud, I know it looks like it says that. It really means this, okay? He says Vayaturu. Yes, reader, I know what Vayaturu means, but I'm going to read it as Vayatiru, lehatir. What does lehatir mean? Right, so in halacha, lehatir means to permit. It's the opposite of le'asor. Something is asur, prohibited. Something is mutar, permitted. So to le'asor something is to make something prohibited, and lehatir it is to permit it. But at the core, why does the verb lehatir mean to permit something in halakha? Because it really means to untie something, to take something that was all knotted up. It was a no, and you opened it up into a yes. Lashon hatarat hakesher. Read this verse, he says, the way you would read the notion of untying a knot. Ki Eretz Yisrael haytak shura. The land of Israel at that time, it was all tied up. It was claimed. Kfuta unetuna bidei shiva amamim. It was bound and claimed. How did I write it here? Compelled by the fact that it was given over to the hands of 7 nations. V'hamaraglim. And interesting, he uses the word that Hamek Davar says is different than Latour. The spies, the Meraglim, Bahalichatamba, by going into that place, Srichim Hayu, they had one primary obligation. Lehatir et hakesher hazeh. To untie the knottedness of the land, or to untie the connection that the people already there had to their land. In a yeshiva in 19th century Lublin, when many decades before Zionism was really becoming a thing in the German Jewish mind, you had a Rebbe who, because he was a religious Jew, had never disconnected his hope and prayer from the notion of returning to the land of Israel, saying something about the original touring of the land of Israel, which is the very thing that weighs so heavily on the notion of modern Zionism, a Zionism which, you know, I am extremely committed to. Right? Extremely committed to the process that began in Parshat Shlach Lecha and the process that miraculously resulted in the land of Israel in the 20th century. But one of the things that was a knot that needed to be untied as Zionism was becoming a reality in the 19th century, and is still being discussed every single day today, is what do we do about the notion that we can't will away that there were people on the land when we got there in the 19th century. There were people on the land when the scouts got there in Parshat Shlach Lecha, and they were sent by their commander. The commander then was Moshe and God, and the commander in the 20th century were the commanders of the Haganah, to try to loosen the tie that connected the contemporaneous people of that land to the land itself. Many of you have heard possibly versions of an aphorism, something like Palestine is a people without a land to a land without a people. Right, a people without a land for a land without a people. It was a romantic notion of the Jews in exile who had been disconnected, untied from their land for 2 millennia, and perfect. They found a land empty of people. It was a people without a land, right? Apparently, the first version of that phrase, before it became an aphorism, was coined by a non-Jew. I remember 19th century, there were many Christian pastors who were also writing and speaking rather floridly about a return to Zion by the Jewish people. And this Reverend Alexander Keith said it like this: the Jews are a people without a country, even as their own land, as subsequently to be shown, is in a great measure a country without a people. And that was recast 6 decades later by Israel Zangwill, who originally was a strident Zionist, and over the course of his time leadership became almost an anti-Zionist. But in his Zionist years, he wrote, Palestine is a country without a people, the Jews are a people without a country, and then, like many famous statements, it gets ascribed to many people over time. I find it fascinating that in the first verse that sends the first group of freed slaves looking for a land in the land of Israel, there's a hint at, even if it's a etymological jump from vayatiru, there's a hint at the unavoidable catastrophe of what's going to happen when a people who want that land are going to get there, and there are people who are already bound to that land, right? And I'm not sure we have moved that far from that notion. I remember when I was in Israel and spending time in the Palestinian territories on the encounter trip, there were lots of claims thrown out by the people we met that really since 1948 and before, Israel has engaged in strategic and demonic and terrible genocide. And when we had an opportunity for us to discuss our experiences on our own, sometimes when you're having an intense experience, your humor gets wry and biting. And I remember some of the people would say to each other, if Israel has been committing genocide, then we're the worst committers of genocide in history, right? Because since 1948, and this is actually good news, the Arab and Palestinian citizens and residents of land, their numbers have flourished and grown, and the population has magnified, right? So if you're, yes, yeah, we're terrible at it, but right? This is to make a half funny joke about something extremely seriously. But the notion of Israel being involved in a genocide is laughable when you look at the numbers have increased. But what's interesting about that is that if you look at the Zionist project through this realm, it's both a strategic catastrophe on some level, that there are more people living in that land who don't want us there and with whom we have to share it than there were 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 decades ago, a millennia ago. And it's also something to be rather proud of, that we've been able to develop Jewish society there without doing now what they did then, because when the Chosev Lublin is looking back on Parshat Shlach Lecha, he's saying that the scouts went in and they actually did that. They did start to untie the connection between the residents of that land and the land. And then when Joshua went in, it was a genocide. It was a conquering. It was a dispossessing of the 7 peoples, so that by the time that was over, the only people who were living there were us. I was not opening up Parshat Shlach Lecha this week to get into some of the thorniest aspects of Zionism. I was saying, what's going to be sweet in the Torah this week? But I found it, and once I found it, I couldn't untie my connection to it. And obviously, in a 24-minute Shabbat afternoon shiur, we're not going to solve this. But I wanted to hand it to you. I wanted to offer it to a group of people who, for the most part, are committed to the notion of Zionism and to the Magen David on that flag and to the wonder of a Jewish return to 1948, recapitulating on some levels Parshat Shlach Lecha, but it recapitulated both aspects of Parshat Shlach Lecha. A divine mishlachat being sent to forge or reforge Jewish connection to the land, and a recognition that the price of doing that will be to get in between people who are already in that land and their claim to it. And I have no idea, obviously, what's going to be in the Middle East in the next 1, 5, 10, 15, 20, 100, 200 years. But I do know that somehow these competing and sometimes utterly perpendicular notions will have to find some way to be in harmony. And that is that we believe we belong there either by divine command or by historical narrative or by a claim earned by might and by blood. And that to stay on that land at the expense of ensuring that no one else is there is undermining something very, very important about a Jewish and ethical Jewish claim to sovereignty and to land itself. And it's right there from the very beginning when they were sent the first time. Larry.
Can I just go back to the original question?
Yeah.
It sheds a little light on what you said just now. And I'm going to answer the question about if I didn't know what Vagaturu meant. And I'm going to say I'm reading that they're sending the Nasi from each tribe, which is a little weird because you normally send the young people
Right.
to scout out. They want people of authority to go. So I would now guess that actually to claim the land, which is what all peoples, not just Western colonialists, have always done, to send their people out to claim the land on their behalf, and then later to conquer it.
Yeah.
And it seems so. It's also very political in
Yeah.
the sense of meaning it. But I think in my defense of partially of what's happened then and what's happened now is that until very recently, this was very natural and normal way in which the world worked everywhere.
Right.
And every peoples who are said to be, quote, indigenous today were at some point conquerors.
Yeah.
With maybe some really tiny exceptions.
What Larry is saying through on Zoom is that what's being described here and is fraught and is complex is how humanity spread across the globe, right? A claim, and then if there was a resistance to that claim, a conquering or a non-conquering, where it's really impossible to find a place on earth, even though the UN likes to focus on a few cities in Israel. It's hard to find a place on earth where you can't uncover a previous claim or a conquered people. Interestingly, one of the few places on earth where you can, here, right? I mean, I don't think we have a real understanding of a historical process by which the indigenous peoples of America conquered it from previous inhabitants. They were probably, they and their descendants, probably the first people who made this continent inhabited. I just started reading a book. It's a book that I bought when I was on the trip to the South. Gosh, I can't remember the name of the book, but it's basically a tour through seven places in the South and resurrecting the stories of those places through the eyes of the enslaved rather than the eyes of the enslaver. And this is written by an African-American author. And he starts off with a little, before even the prologue, he says he's going to be talking about places like New Orleans and the Whitney Plantation and these cities, and he's trying to resurrect the voices of the people who lived there under oppression. But he also wanted to give homage in this, as someone who's writing, claiming that when land is tainted by blood, we have to reckon with it. He wanted to give homage to the Native American and indigenous peoples who had claimed that land before the French did and before the British did and before the Spanish did. And so he named the tribes who have tribal claim to New Orleans and Washington, D.C. and places like that. And I would think that you probably don't have to, even no matter how woke you get, you probably don't have to get farther back than that, right? No one is claiming that the Choctaw conquered it from a previous culture that was there. But you're right, for the most part, that's exactly how land came to be. Joel. And then
give
Warren.
a plug for the first Baruch Link Scholar in Residence program. We're having an Israeli author named David Rabinyan, who wrote a book called All the Rivers. And it's about an Israeli woman who's living in New York who becomes the lover of an Arab Palestinian man. And parts of it are just basically an interesting West Side Story, Romeo and Juliet type of romance. But there's one scene in which his brother comes, also Palestinian, and they get into a discussion or actually a fight in which she is articulating the Israeli position as to why Israel should remain a Jewish state separate from the Palestinians, and her boyfriend's brother is really brilliantly articulating the reason why that's so wrong.
Yes.
And it's really, I think, the finest writing in the whole book,
Wow.
and makes me look forward to hearing her. But that's one place where you can find good articulation of both arguments right now, and very little hope that
Yes.
it's going to be resolved anytime soon.
In case that wasn't heard on the Zoom, Jill was giving an early plug for the first Baruch Lang Scholar in Residence Weekend that we're doing the last weekend in October, and we're bringing an Israeli author whose novel tries to bring voices to both sides to claim that land. Warren, and then we'll bench, then Marif, yeah. Yeah.
I think what's if I think about it, what ultimately conquered the Jewish state was like a superpower, right? It was Babylonia,
Mm-hmm.
and then later
The Romans.
And in a sense, Israel may have been a superpower vis-a-vis those seven nations. They were small little body towns almost.
Right.
And so I think that in terms of the future, I think the superpowers, whatever superpowers are conquering other superpowers, it's like more on a cyber level.
Mm.
Okay, I think it's going to be more. It's not. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So just to repeat that for the Zoomers, what Warren is saying is that probably in ancient society, and even now, when the land of Israel has been conquered, it's been conquered by the superpowers of the generation, whether it's the Babylonians or the Romans or the Ottomans, and that perhaps the next superpowers that will come, we can't really predict them, but it might be on a cyber level as opposed to straight military level. Let's end here with a topic opened, with a wound opened, and intentionally not sewn up, but something for us to remind ourselves that we have to reckon with when we sing Hatikva and when we say that we go back home and we articulate our love for the land of Israel. That love has been complicated for 3,000 years. We'll say Kaddish Rabbanan, and then we'll bench, and then we'll do. Actually, let's bench first. Joey, do you want to read? Do you want to lead?
Az Yamale Sechok Pinu Ul Shonenu Rina Az Yomeruva Goim Higdil Adonai La Soti Mele Higdil Adonai La Soti Manu Hainu Semechim Shuva Adonai Et Shavitenu Kafikim Ba Negeb Hazorim Bedima Berina Iktoru Aloch Yelechu Vacho No Se Meshech Hazarabo Yavo Verina No Se Alumotav Tehilat Adonai Daber Pi Vivarech Kol Basar Shim Kuchul Elam Ba'ed Va'anachnu Nevarech Yah Me'ata V'ad Elam Hallelujah Odu Adonai Ki Tov Ki Le'olam Kasto Miyem Alil Gevurot Adonai Yashmiya Kol Tehilato Rabotai Nevarech Yehi Shem Adonai Mevarach Me'ata V'ad Elam B'Yishur Chavirai Nevarech Elohim Shechal Nemishelo Baruch Elohim Shechal Nemishelo V'Tivo Chayinu Baruch Shemo Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Hazan et Haolam Kulo B'Tuvo B'Chein B'Chesed U'Rachamim Hu Notein Lechem L'Chol Basar Ki L'Olam Chasdo Uv'Tuvo Hagadol Tamid L'Chasar Lanu Ve'al Yachsar Lanu Mazon L'Olam Va'ed Bavur Shemo Hagadol Kiwel Zan Farnes Lakol Umetiv Lakol Umechin Mazon L'chol beriot asher bara baruch atah Adonai hazan et hakol nedach Adonai.
As we finish up benching, we'll turn to Ksei Kadish Rabbanan, page 38 in the Lev Shalem. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah v'yalmad yivrach yerutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael v'agala v'yizman kari v'yimru amen. Yehi shemei rabbah mevorach leolam leomei olamaya. Arach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnasei v'yithadar v'yitale v'yitalal shmei kudisha b'richu Leila min kol berachata v'shirata v'shbechata v'nechamata amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Tamidehon v'al kol Tamidehon v'al kol man da'askin b'araita di v'atra hadein v'di b'chol atar v'atar yehei lahon ulchon shlama rabba china v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin arichin zon arivicha u'forkana min kodam abahon di v'shmaya v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya Chaim Aleinu v'Yakol Yisrael v'Imru Amen. Oseh Shalom Ramav u'Rachamav Yaseh Shalom Aleinu v'Yakol Yisrael v'Imru Amen. Thanks, Joey. Well, Mariv begins in the Lev Shalom, page 264. I think in the Slim Shalom, it's I don't remember. I don't remember where it is.
137.
137. In the weekday Slim Shalom it's 137. 200 in the full volume Sim Shalom.
והוא רחום מכפר עוון ולא ישחית ועבד לשבע פה ולא ירחק חמתו אדוני הושיע המלך יעננו ויום קוראנו ברכו את אדוני המבורך ברוך למבורך לעולם ועד אל חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך לעולם ועד ברוך אתה אדוני המרעיב ערבים ואהבתך תעשה ממנו לעולמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו ישראל. שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם, משה בני ישראל לכאן לשירה בשמחה רבה וימלכו לעם. מי כמוך בן מנוי, מי כמוך נר בקודש, ראיתי לו אותו סעיף אלה. מלכותך ובניך בקיים לפני משה, זה אלינו ויאמרו, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב, וגולו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל. השכיבנו אלוהינו לשלום, עמידנו מקינו לחיים ופרוסנו סוכה שמך. ושמור צאתנו ובאנו לחיים ושלום ייטב יד עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני שומר עמו ישראל לעד. ברוך אדוני לעולם אמן ואמן. כי המלכות שלך היא עולמי עד תמלוך בכבוד, כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, המלך בכבודו, תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ועל כל מעשיו. יתגדל ויקדש מרבה, בעלמא דברי חירותי ומחנכותי, וחי יכונה ויכונה וחי לכל בישראל, בעגלה וזמן קריב ומרמן. יש מי רבה מבורך, לעולם עמי עמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתבר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלש מן הקודשה, בריחו. להילה מן כל ברכתה וישרתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, תמירם ביומה ויאמרו אמן.
יתגדל ויגדש מרבה, בעלמא דבר חיותי ולמיכה חוטי, וחי יכול ויכון וחי לכו בישראל, בעגלה בזמן קריב ימרמן. יש מי רבה מבורך, לעולמו מעלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם וינשא, ויתהדר ויתהלל ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריחו, לעולם מכל ברכתה ושורתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, תמירם ביומה וימרמן. והינו אמרנו אלינו, אלוהינו עלינו מעשה ידינו, כונני עלינו מעשה ידינו כוננהו, יושב בסתר עליון. אורך ממשביעהו וירושעתי, אורך ממשביעהו וירושעתי. ואתה קדוש יושב תהילות ישראל וקרא זלזל ואמר, קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות מלך הארץ כבודו. ותישאני רוח וישמע רק כל רעש גדול, ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו. אדוני ימלוך עולם ועד. צדקת כצדק לעולם ותורתך אמת. יהי רצון לפניך אלוהינו ולאמתנו. ויפתחו בך יראי שמך, כי לא עזבת דושך אדוני, אדוני חפץ למען צדקו, יגדיל תורה ויאדיר. יתגדל ויקדש מרבה, בעלמא דברך חיותי ולממך חוטי, וחי יכון ומיכון וחי לכו בישראל, בעגלה בזמן קריב ימרמן. יש מי רבה מבורך, לעולמו מעלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם וינשא, ויתהדר ויתהלל ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריחו. לעולם עם כל ברכתה וישורתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דמירם ביומה וימרמן. תתקבל צלות הון ובהון לכל ישראל, קדם ובהון ושמיה וימרמן. יהי שלום רבין שמיה, וחיים עלינו ויעקב ישראל וימרמן. ועושה שלום במרומה, והוא יעשה שלום עלינו ויעקב ישראל וימרו אמן. עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל. על כן נקבל לך אלוהינו, לרומר ותפארתך, להעביר גלים מן הארץ, וללים קרות יכרתו. כך כתוב בתורתך, אדוני מלוך עולם ועד, ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אחד ושמו אחד. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחיי חון וביומי חון ובחיי דרכו בישראל, בעגלה בזמן קריב אמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ומעלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתהלל ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו, לעולם מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, תמירם ביומה ויאמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ויעקב ישראל ויאמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ויעקב ישראל ויאמרו אמן.
Baruch Adonai HaMavdil Ben Kodesh Lecho. HaMavdil Ben Kodesh Lecho. Chocho Hatoteinu Imcho. Zareinu Bechaspeinu Yarbe Yarbe Kacho. Lekachochavim Balayla.
Just undo. Staring at you. Yeah. Mashiach ben David. Mashiach. Yeah.
David, friends, good luck, and a sweet, easy, peaceful week. Next week, there's no Zoom Shabbat Mincha.
Oh.
It's all going to be at B'nai David. We're having this joint B'nai David service, and they are allowing us to gather at B'nai David as an egalitarian.
B'nai David. Oh, it's at B'nai David. Okay.
No digital version of Mincha Sudash Lishi Maariv next week, just as a one-off. But we hope that you do coming to B'nai David and to hear Rabbi Aaron Leibowitz speak.
I didn't think so. Yeah, I guess they won't do it there. They won't let you do Zoom there. Yeah. Okay. It's not his thing. Yeah, I think they're doing that during the day, though. They're speak. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess that's it. That's it. Yeah. Was he staring at us? Well, there weren't that many people on, so. Yeah. I'm talking about zooming in tomorrow. Talking in. He's just saying next Shabbat. Yeah. There's no Mincha Maariv Zoom because it's at B'nai David. Yeah. Anyway, I guess you could turn it off. Plug it back in. Probably. Yeah, it's probably. I will do that. All righty. We did it, honey. Leave.